My name is Danish Husain. I tell stories. But the medium that I choose to tell my story, that sometimes slots me as a poet or as an actor. Is it on? No. As a theater director or as a plain simple storyteller. But whichever medium I choose, essentially I am telling a story. And I've done that for almost 2.5 decades now. And it has taught me a thing or two, which I intend to share. One of the things that I learned as a storyteller is that no matter how much you are in control of your story, you might even be the creator of your own story. But after a point of time, the story acquires its own life, its own integrity. And if you choose to tell the story by compromising its integrity, let's say by introducing your random biases or random propositions or tugging the story with your motivations, then possibly your story will fail to impress the audience. And in that case, even with your best attempt, you will not be able to get your story across to your audiences. Real life is also like that. In real life, we become our own story. We are the narrator. And thus it is important that we keep our integrity intact. I've realized that simple things, like by being punctual, by keeping your word, by delivering what you promised, you can go a long way to get your integrity. It's not a one-time act. It's a function of consistency. If you are consistent over a period of time, you would achieve integrity. So it is important that when you tell the story, you keep the story's integrity intact, because a story told with its integrity intact will not only redeem itself, but will redeem the teller. Eventually, we all are nothing but a sum of our own stories. But before I kind of go ahead into what storytelling taught me, let's go back to the start of my story. I did not begin my career in theater or cinema. I trained as an economist and I acquired a management degree like you. I worked in banks for 5.5 years. But very soon, while working in banks, I realized that I've made a wrong decision. In my haste to land a job, I said yes to something that I did not sign up for. I ended up being in the retail section of the bank, which in no way utilized my skill as an economist or my training as an economist. And coupled with the disappointing corporate culture, my inability to make a mark at my job, my inability to shift to a division which is more befitting to my skills, I increasingly became disenchanted. Theater did not begin as an alternate career. It basically started with me trying to fill more colors in my dull leaves, in some way trying to mitigate my suffering at this dull job. For 3 years, I concurrently worked at the bank and did amateur theater. And over a period of time, I realized this is exactly what I want to do. I recall, when I stepped on stage, something transformative started happening. Till then, I had a very mediocre run in my life. But when I stepped on stage, something transformative happened, in the sense that people started appreciating my performances. That was a very new experience to me. And many years later, when, in a press interview, I was asked, I said, I did not chuck my bank job because of any bravery or courage. These are labels that we give ourselves. Normally, we land a certain choice because we have run out of choices. I had run out of my choices. And it was more than that, the appreciation that I got from the audiences. And I've firmly come to believe this, that now, when you see someone doing a job well, when you see someone very good at what they do, appreciate that. Show your genuine gratitude for that. You never know what your words can do to somebody. Somebody's appreciation did spark my life. So it's very important to appreciate when somebody is doing their job well. 3 years into this career as an actor, I stumbled upon Dastan Goi, which is a lost art form of Urdu story. And I was quite blown away by this art form. I had never seen such heady marriage of literature and performance. The last time I had witnessed something like this was when I witnessed Marsiya, which is another art form where long epic poems, Marsiyas are long epic poems, particularly about the tragedy of Karbala, which are performed in a very religious context. So that was the last time when I had seen this kind of marriage between literature and performance. But Marsiya Goi is religious in its context. Dastan Goi was very secular. It could be performed anywhere. It could be done in any setting. And more than that, the format of Dastan was such that it can subsume anything. You want to do a political critique, you want to do a social satire, you want to do cultural stock taking, you want to talk about poetry, you want to list anything that you are in possession of. Dastan Goi allowed all of that. And it allowed in such a way that you could do storytelling disregarding the rules of storytelling. And yet, you would come back as if, you come back on a sum in the cyclical rhythm of a tal or percussion. You would come back and you would make coherent, consistent sense to your listener. So that was the part of it which intrigued me a lot. The other aspect about Dastan was that actually Dastan is really not storytelling. It's the anti-story. Because one of the greatest skill of a Dastan Go was Dastan Rokna, which means to stop a story. But we will come more to that. Let me explain what Dastan Goi is. So Dastan Goi consists of two words. Dastan, which is a long epic story, which you need to have several sittings before you could conclude the story, very much like modern day soap operas. And Goi in Persian means to speak. So Dastan Goi is a portmanteau word, which means to tell a Dastan, to recite a Dastan, as Marsiya Goi is to recite a Marsiya. Now these tales, these are specifically associated with the story of Amir Hamza. There are many Dastans in the world which are very famous. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey is very famous. Firdausi's Shahnameh is very famous. You've heard of Alf Laila. Then there is Ramayana, there is Mahabharata. But the Dastan which became associated with the art form of Dastan Goi is the story of Amir Hamza. Now these stories have an Arabic or a Persian origin, but they came to India sometimes in the Mughal. And by the time Akbar sat on his throne, he was so impressed by these stories that he commissioned the largest, the biggest art project in the Mughal history, where these stories were illustrated on canvas paintings, 3 feet by 2.5 feet, and some 1,400 paintings were done in the Mughal atelier over a period of 15 years, from 1562 to 1577. Out of those 1,400 folios, roughly just 100 folios survive today, and 61 of them are at Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna. Now these paintings, these stories, they were contained in a one-volume story across the world. Dastan was very famous in Southern Europe, in Northern Africa, in Middle East, in Central Asia, in India, in Southeast Asia, in China. But the story which was famous was contained in one volume. Soon enough, the Indian storytellers, they started telling these stories, but they started getting bored with the one-volume version they knew of. So what they started doing, they started reinventing the wheel. They started improvising, they started adding elements of magic, sorcery, of trickery in Dastan. And by the time in 19th century, Munshi Nawal Kishore in Lucknow decided to print these stories, this one-volume story expanded into a mammoth 46-volume enterprise, a collective authorship of 6 writers over a period of 34 years from 1883 to 1970, thus making Dastan-e-Amir Hamza the longest written romance epic in the world. There is no story which runs into 42,000 pages in anywhere in the world except here in India. The next set of stories which Dastan-e-Amir Hamza inspired was Chandrakanta. When Pandit Devkinandan Khatri, he adapted Dastan-e-Amir Hamza in an Indian context, and Amir Hamza becomes Chandrakanta in those stories. But the skill which really attracted me towards Dastan Goi was Dastan Rokna. Why would a storyteller stop the story? Dastan Rokna is where you stop the story, but the narration continues, the bayan continues. Why would a storyteller stop the story, the plot of the story, and continue with the narration? I realized that oral storytelling, there basically has two aspects to it. One is textural and the other is structural. The textural aspect of a storytelling is the sensory response a story evokes in you. And that response helps you build the imaginary world when you are listening to a story. But the problem is that this imaginary world that you are building in your head when a storyteller is talking to you is very elusive. It has a very dreamlike, a very gossamer, a very ephemeral quality to it. The slightest of distraction and the spell will break for you. So the storyteller had to make sure that they spellbind. They constantly keep you engaged. And in order to do that, in order to hold on to their listeners' attention, they started inventing various ways, segues, detours, digressions, stories within stories, literally orally hypnotizing you so that you do not get distracted. And thus, by inventing these hacks, these segues, these stories within stories formats, these rabbit holes, these tangential formats, they used intertextuality, using different kind of texts, and then they kind of held on to your attention. They kind of tapped in our innate need for adventure. Because what is our innate need for adventure? We want to embark on a journey, and then we want to get lost. And then we desire to be found again. And when we are found again, there is a joy of being found again. And then again, the yearning for a new journey starts. So that's what the storyteller did. They tapped onto that. And they did that by breaking linear narratives into circular narratives, into detours, into stories within stories, into tangential formats, and thus bringing you back again to the story. And that's when you marvel, because you've been taken on an adventure, you find yourself lost, and then you come back and you find yourself, oh, it's the same story that I'm in right now. That's why Dastan Rukna became such a great feat. But Dastan Rukna went one step ahead. Here, the storyteller is holding on to your attention by not telling you a fascinating story, but by stopping the story and continuing with description. That's why Dastan Rukna became such a great skill, such a great format. Then the other aspect of storytelling is structural. There are 5 elements which kind of make the edifice of an oral storytelling experience. One is the story, the other is the listener, third is the teller, 4 is the space, and 5th is the larger world, the context in which the story is being told. Now, a good story is like a good poem, like what the American poet Louis Gluck said, that poetry haunts, and it haunts because it is simultaneously utterly clear and deeply mysterious. And thus it cannot be accounted for, and it cannot be exhausted. A great story can never be exhausted. Great stories have the quality to appropriate their listeners. They consume their listeners, so much so that they become the listener's stories. All great stories in the world are self-propagating stories. So, just to have a good story is not good enough. You must also understand why you tell it. What is the unsaid in the story? Sometimes the unsaid in the story is greater than the said part of the story. वो बात सारे फसाने में जिसका जिक्र ना था, वो बात उनको बहुत नागवार गुजरी है. So, what is the elephant in the room? What is the subtext? What is in between the lines? Unless you do not have clarity of that, unless you don't layer your story, unless you don't make it inexhaustible, the story would fall flat. Then the next thing is the teller. You as a teller must realize what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are your limitations. You should be able to understand what your voice patterns are, what your speech patterns are. And one must realize that there is no good way or a bad way or a right way or a wrong way of telling a story. There is only an effective way of telling. So if we are able to understand our limitations, our weaknesses, if we are able to kind of adapt it in such a way that they become an advantage for us. One of the ways which you need to understand is that The most attractive quality about people is when they are very comfortable in their skin. And in order to be comfortable in their skin, you will have to accept yourself. You'll have to make sure that you make peace with yourself. And the more settled you become with yourself, the chances are that even your weakness, your limitation will become an advantage. So as a teller, you need to understand that. Then the third aspect is your audience. Who's your audience? Who are you telling the story? Are these older people? Are these children? Are these peers? Is it a hostile audience? Is it a friendly audience? Is it an indifferent audience? Is it a foreign audience? Is it a people like us audience? Is it a people who understand your language? Is it an audience that doesn't understand your language? Is there a cultural difference? Unless you do not factor these things in, possibly your story will not reach out. So who your audience is, critical understanding of that is very important. Then the space. The space is very important. Is it an intimate conversation? Is it a public address? Is it a marriage pandal? Is it a boardroom? Is it an investors meet? Is it a sales pitch? Is it a marketplace? Where are you telling your story? Because the place where you're telling your story, the acoustics of that place, the capacity of that place would change the way you would tell your story, right? कौन सी बात कहाँ कैसे कही जाती है, ये सलीका हो तो हर बात सुनी जाती. So that's very important to understand, to read the room. What is the room right now and how do I do that? Then the final thing is the world at large. The world at large is the context in which you are telling the story. Sometimes the context is by, giving a preamble. Sometimes it is by juxtaposing with what is happening in real. Because it is important to understand that there is nothing apolitical. Everything is political. And in that scenario, it is important for you to understand who has the control over the story, who has the control over the narrative. That is very important. You must always have the choice to choose a story for yourself. And you must also have the choice to tell your own story. That should not be taken away from you. Because great stories empower people. They don't disenfranchise people. And when the moral order of the world is collapsing, what possibly can save us is a good story. Thank you.